freedom means for them licentiousness, what they can do. It is not freedom in the construct of what it was the Enlightenment value, the freedom to think, the freedom to speak, the freedom to dare, freedom to question. All of those are now being suffocated. If you question wokeism, then you are a bigot, you are a racist, right? So what has happened is the inversion of a free society in that classic sense.
With us today is Professor Salim Mansur of Western University in London, Ontario. Good day, Salim.
Good day, good morning.
I'd like to set the stage for our discussion today, Salim, by revisiting the anti-Vietnam War protests of the 1960s. During that time, the song "Where Have All the Flowers Gone" by Pete Seeger and Joe Hickerson rose to the top of the charts as perhaps the quintessential anti-war song. It is fitting that Seeger's lyrics were inspired by a Cossack folk song. The roots of the Cossacks, of course, are thought by some to have originated north of the Black Sea near the Dnieper River, the very area in Ukraine, now Russia, currently embroiled in war. Complementing that song, the term flower power came about as a result of an anti-war protester named Ed Sanders putting rose stems in the rifle barrels of soldiers of the 503rd Military Police Battalion during a march on the Pentagon on October 21st, 1967. That march was attended by between 100,000 and 200,000 protesters. We would later learn that Ed Sanders was a beatnik poet, a nonconformist, postmodern, bohemian hedonist, a man who typified the philosophy of that counterculture generation. Fast forward to today, where we have yet another war in which the United States is embroiled, yet this war is being cheered on by the people in power, the press, and by the vast majority of the people at large. Very few protests have occurred in the United States against this US-Russia proxy war. The largest may have been the Rage Against the War Machine demonstration, which took place at the Lincoln Memorial on February 19th of this year, but it only drew a few thousand protesters. So, Salim, where are the protesters? Where is the outrage of yet another US war in their endless chain of wars feeding their military-industrial complex and the insatiable cabal of neocons? Or, to put it another way, where have all the flowers gone?
Very good question. It is not only where have all the flowers gone, where has the left gone? I mean, if we are talking raising the question, you're putting it in context of the Vietnam War. That's a half a century ago now, right? A whole 2-3 generation of people have come along. People who are now in the same age or cohort of our current prime minister, were not born or were infants, children, right? So there's been a generational change. And with the generational change, or several generational change, there has been a political change in effect that has taken place in North America and United States as the epicenter of what was at that time called with, I think, in many ways quite correctly, and people took that view seriously. That is, the United States was the center of the free world, the leader of the free world. We were part of that free world. All of that has to be put in context. What has happened? It's not only where the flowers is gone, what has happened to the free world, and therefore the politics that has changed. But politics is downstream. It is the culture that has changed. So if we really want to explore why today, at this point in time, when we are really at the precipice, I mean, as we are speaking today, July 11th, the collective West, that is NATO, is meeting in Vilnius, Lithuania. a NATO meeting, and the principal topic is, of course, the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, led by NATO, US, the European Union, the collective West. Our prime minister is there, who has announced ahead of the conference that Canada will double the contribution to this war effort, and will increase the manpower support for the Ukraine war. And there is not a sound anywhere in Canada, not a word. Same thing, except for few voices in the alternate media, people like Colonel Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter, and others. No one is speaking about the war. The only political leader who has stood up and spoken against the war is Donald Trump, the former president. And I think Robert J. Kennedy has talked about it, but he has talked about it in a murky way. He's against the war, but he defends the rights of Ukraine and the support for Ukraine and so on and so forth. And the question, again, that's a historical question that we can go into. But we are really at the edge of the precipice of a possible escalation into a nuclear war. And the collective West is sleeping. There's an upsurge in violence and opposition in Europe. I came back from Europe only a few weeks ago, just ahead of the outbreak in France, and now the fall of the government in the Netherlands. Is it related to the war? Is there a peace movement that is bringing this about? Well, at least from all observable data, that's not the case. It's the internal problem of economics, soaring prices, hyperinflation, the level of unemployment, and so on and so forth. And of course, the big elephant in the room is the effects of open door migration and immigration into Europe, and of course also in North America. But the question that you're asking, where have the flowers gone? What about the peace movement? We see a deathly silence from all the institutions in the Western world that are supposed to be the leaders in thought, in ideas, and therefore in politics, which is what was there happening in the 1960s that you're talking about. Singers were leading the songs, singing, crowds were gathering around. There was a war going on. There was a fear that that war could escalate. We're talking about the Vietnam War, and a genuine movement took place. Whether that genuine movement eventually ended the war or the war was ended because Vietnam was not going to be defeated, and America could not defeat Vietnam except going nuclear. And that was not the purpose. And so Americans eventually withdrew. It was a defeat for America, for whatever objective America had gone into, which we can discuss. But it had to withdraw, and Vietnam was united. And it now is an independent, united country, Indochina and Vietnam. So all of that has to be brought into, I suppose, discussing what has happened to the West, what has happened to the culture of the West, that we are in this situation where there are no church leaders. During the Vietnam War, there were church leaders, there were priests and fathers. The most famous priests, if you recall, Robert, were the Berrigan brothers, Father Berrigan, Daniel Berrigan, Catholic priests who were right out there, who were taken to prison. There were others, the Catholic Church, the Protestant churches. So the church was at the forefront of the peace movement during the Vietnam War, and which was carried over into the peace campaign against for nuclear disarmament into the late 70s and early 80s. Even we had our own prime minister at that time, the father of the current prime minister, Pierre Trudeau, re-elected in 1980, who went public with his campaign for peace and against nuclear disarmament when Ronald Reagan came to.
You mean for nuclear disarmament?
Yeah. And he, on the foreign policy side, on the domestic side, he and the country was preoccupied with the constitutional issues, but on the foreign policy side, Pierre Trudeau, the prime minister, took up a position to go abroad, to go to Europe, to meet with the leaders, and to talk about the peace movement, nuclear disarmament and peace. People felt threatened with the possibility of another escalation as it happened in Cuban crises, and the two superpowers edging towards a nuclear confrontation. So yes, things have dramatically changed, and we can argue and we can say which was important and which is not, or lay it down. But one thing is pretty much clear. The West, the collective West, is a much degraded society in terms about the most fundamental issue in our time, in our age, that is the nuclear age, that is the issue of war and peace, that there can be no war. There must not be any war. And that if that's what we are edging towards, every other issue then takes a backseat, is of no consequence. Whether we have a climate change policy, whether we have a new Green Deal, whether we have, digital banking, or what have you, it doesn't matter, because everything, the world will be inherited by cockroaches, after a nuclear war, and there is no further discussion. So I would say politics has changed. I mean, everything that we can associate with the peace movement of the last half century, but even going before the half century, going back to World War I, there was a peace movement, an anti-war movement. People like Bertrand Russell went to prison in opposing that war. That was seen as a movement of the left. The left was the peace party. The left was the party of the working class, of the poor, of the lower middle class or middle class, And in that sense, the right was the party of what later on Eisenhower came to define the military-industrial complex. The right was the party of the imperialists, the colonialists. Right was the party, in other words, of the warmongers. And so the left and the right, in that sense, no longer exists. And that, I think, is one of the key questions to deal with. What has happened to the left?
Could it be,
where did the left disappear?
Could it be, Salim, that a few observations? One is that the people of that era, the Allen Ginsbergs and the Ed Sanders, etc., they were born in the 40s. The Beatnik generation were born in the late 30s, early 40s. They did not go to war, yet they saw their fathers. In the United States, they lost over 400,000 men in the Second World War. And these people were brought up by their mothers, or by fathers who came back and who were mentally destroyed by what they saw and did in the Second World War. And so you have this counterculture. They're rallying against what they saw to be the cause of their misery, of their fatherlessness, or of the degradation of the nuclear family at the time and the destruction of the country economically. So you have these beatniks. By the way, the word beat in beatnik means upbeat. It doesn't necessarily mean the beat of a drum. It means, as opposed to downtrodden, they're upbeat. So the beatniks came along with their bizarre poetry, their bizarre songs, their strange lyrics, their counterculture, their irrationality. And that's what they were. They were irrational. They were bohemians. They were pushing the windows of what is acceptable sexually, drug use, all of that. So they came out in retaliation of the Second World War. And here they saw another world war. But, and here's a distinction, the Vietnam War was a war of the communist North and the capitalist so-called South after the French lost in that region for the Vietnam independence. They were separated. Ho Chi Minh in the north, the communists, and you had the South. And so they were supposed to have elections. The elections did not happen. And if you want to hear more about this, there's a great conversation between William F. Buckley and Robert Vaughn, the actor, talking about this. And Robert Vaughn actually earned his PhD and gave a dissertation or thesis about this war. You can find it online. But so what the left, we call the left communist, collectivist, for a more general term. So they were protesting a war where we were trying to prevent communism from overtaking Vietnam. So you could almost look at it as like they were on the side of the communists, or in that era, we would call them today globalists. Communism, the domino effect. If South Vietnam falls, there goes Cambodia, there goes Laos, there goes Australia. It was seen as a domino effect of global communism. What we have today, they're supporting Ukraine. Could Ukraine be the equivalent of a North Vietnam? I mean, they're globalist. In this case, they're fascist, neo-Nazis, against Russia, which is a national government, right? I mean, they're pro-nationalistic, pro-Russia, anti-communist, anti-globalist. Do you see a parallel there between those two things?
No, I see the point that you're trying to make, and the issue that you're raising, and the way you're trying to contextualize it. If you want to contextualize the Vietnam War, the debate is, was the Vietnam War a communist war? That is, the Vietnamese uprising, was it a communist uprising? Or was it a nationalist uprising that took on the flavor of, in the context of a bipolar world? Remember, 1945, the Soviet army marches into Berlin, and Europe is divided in that sense. But Soviet army marches into Berlin as an ally of the United States. Soviet army marches into Berlin and defeats the German army, the Nazi army, at a price that the Soviet Union has paid, which later on the first president would recognize as immense, as unpayable. That is President Kennedy in his famous peace speech, where he talked about over 20 million dead, and a part of Soviet Union that would, to put it analogously, from the Atlantic coast to Chicago, in the American context, was almost wiped out, and everything else. So it was an ally. But in a flip of a switch, so to speak, and that's another topic, another discussion, Soviet Union was turned into an enemy, and the Cold War began. Franklin Roosevelt was dead and gone, and the whole thing that came about, and then the dropping of the A-bomb in Japan, and so on and so forth, and this binary system, the bipolar world emerged. And so, again, it was not only George Bush who said in the 1990, after 9/11, either you're with us or against us. It began all of that. Either you are with us, you are with the free world, or you are the enemy of the free world. You're communist, and so on and so forth. So it is in that context, the collapse of the European colonial empires, primarily the French in Indochina. They were defeated power. They had been defeated. Indochina the French were defeated in Europe. And the empire, as a sense, was gone, or was going to go. Same thing began with the British and, of course, the other European powers. And these colonial empires were going to fall apart, and was falling apart. And so it was an internal struggle that was taking place. The falling apart was taking place in China. So, again, it's a very complex history, but the point is that who were these people? Who was Ho Chi Minh? Who were the Viet Minh, and that had fought the French and sought independence, and just as it was happening in China, let me to put it again in context. Let me share with you a story, a very small story, but it just highlights everything of what you were pointing out. On the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of Vietnam, or with which the Viet Minh were associated, and Ho Chi Minh was in a sense part of that movement and leader. There was a gathering in Hanoi, and this is in the 70s before Ho Chi Minh died, and the Fraternal Communist Party members from around the world came to Hanoi. And so was the leader of the Communist Party of India, Mr. Dutt, Mohammed Dutt, his name was. And later on, a conversation between the Indian Communist Party leader and Ho Chi Minh was published. And I think Mr. Mohammed Dutt talked about it, and people picked it up, reporters, and they published it. And the conversation was, the Indian Communist Party leader asked Ho Chi Minh, Comrade Ho, the Indian Communist Party is the oldest communist party in Asia. People don't know that, they've forgotten that. Historically, Indian Communist Party was founded before the Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921. And the Indian Communist Party leaders participated in the conference of the Third International, founded by Lenin in Moscow in 1920-21. So this current leader then, 50 years ago, almost in 1970s, is asking Comrade Ho, how do you explain that we in India have not been able to bring about a revolution, and take power, whereas you and China have been able to do that? And Comrade Ho replied, I think the main reason, if not one of the reasons, the main reason is that in India you had Mahatma Gandhi. You see, Mahatma Gandhi became the national leader of the Indian Congress Party. It was a nationalist movement which was led by Mahatma Gandhi and then the other leaders of the Congress, that came around. It was not a religious-based party. It was not a party that was a communist party. It was a party for independence. And it was the Indian National Congress Party and the Mahatma Gandhi that became a model for the African National Congress that subsequently, defeated the apartheid and came to power with Mandela. And it is called the African National Congress. And Mahatma Gandhi's career began in South Africa. So I tell the story to, again, explain that for the West, it was the communists. That is, for the United States, it was the communists. But for the people of Indochina, for the people of India, for the people of Indonesia, this was the uprising, the nationalist uprising for independence. And in places where the Communist Party and communist leadership provided the leadership to the people, then those places, as in Vietnam, turned red. Not in India. India is the largest democracy in the world today. It has Communist Party. And those communist parties have participated in democratic election and won power in their provincial position. India is a federation. So I think that has to be kept in mind. So coming back to the post-World War situation in America, and you're very right that Where Are the Flowers Gone, or Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul and Mary, and the whole lot. I mean, Simon Garfunkel and others. One of my favorite singer was Joan Baez, if you remember her.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they were all children of the 40s. They are the boomers, so to speak. They were born to parents who had gone to war, come back from war, raised by single parents, if they had lost the father, the mothers at home, the grandparents, and that is true. But this generation, America lost 500,000 people in the war, both in Europe and in Japan, compared to Soviet Union or the Russian having lost almost, now we know, close to 30 million people in the war. But this generation came of age after the war. That is, in the 50s, they came of age, in a society, in a country that was the most powerful and the richest country in the world. The American economy, the GDP, was over 50% of the world's GDP. Today, that GDP has declined, and this is the second behind China in terms of GDP. It was the center of the world manufacturing and all other activities that you can think of. It was the leader in technology, in science, Universities opened up, and with the GI Bill, all the people who came back and they were going into the colleges, they were taking on degrees, and their children then would. This is the generation that grew up, what later on John Kenneth Galbraith, the professor at Harvard, economist, who worked with and served in the administration of John F. Kennedy, who had served also in the administration of Franklin Roosevelt during the war, called the age of affluence. This was the most affluent generation in all of history that you can think about, But this was also a generation that grew up under the shadow of the mushroom cloud. So there you have it. You have the most affluent generation that came of age, with technology and the science and education that was available and provided. And the whole world was in envy of envy. I say it in a positive sense. America was the leader, was a beacon of freedom. Everybody wanted to be in America. Good, bad, and ugly. The ugly American didn't matter. America was it. America had been physically untouched by the war. Nobody in America of that generation had seen people walking along with guns, shooting up their neighbors in a war. It was untouched. No city had been bombed. No foreign troops had landed on American shores, etc., etc.
Well, there was Pearl Harbor.
Devastated. Pardon?
I say there was Pearl Harbor, but other than that, you're correct.
Yeah, the heartland of America, and Europe was devastated. Asia was devastated. So this generation that we're talking about, they came of age, and so here we are in the 60s. They came of age, and the peace movement that we are associating with, talking about, is the peace movement that began as a result of the Vietnam War, right? It is in the midst of the Vietnam War that this peace movement came together and became a huge factor. But this peace movement that came together was also came together or converged with other social and political and cultural events taking place that converged together. This was also the period and time. In 63 was John F. Kennedy's assassination, then, Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, Malcolm X's assassination, Robert F. Kennedy's assassination. Cities were burning. So this was, again, the tremendous conversion that was taking place in America based upon race, that is a black and white issue, civil rights movement, that converged with also the Vietnam War movement. So we're talking about the 60s, with those two things converged. There was a whole technological shift that was taking place in America. And of course, in the Western world. It had begun earlier, but the effects were coming together in the 60s and would then transform the American society. That's the cultural side of it. And as I have always argued, culture is upstream, politics and economics in that sense is downstream. One of the critical and most seminal development and change that has yet to completely play out in our lifetime was the coming of the pill. And the coming of the pill in the late 50s changed the entire nature of the very fundamental pillar of a society and of a culture, that is the nature of a family, you know. And though the children born in the 1940s that we're talking about, the Bob Dylan, the Joan Baez, and, in the case of Canada, people like Gordon Lightfoot, I mean, he was again part of that tradition, folk singing and peace song, what was his most famous song? Black Day in July, and that was referring to the civil rights movement, Detroit burning, and so on and so forth. And of course, in the backdrop is the Vietnam War. This affluent generation came of age with where the pill was going to change the entire sexual mores of the society as women came to the workforce, and the nature of family and then the sexual relationship would be fundamentally altered. Families, especially Catholic families, that were large families. I mean, our own former prime minister, Jean Chrétien, I believe he was one child in a family of something like 12 or more children, right? And then within his lifetime, I mean, he was born in, I think, early 1930s, so he's in his 90s now. Within his lifetime, Quebec, a Catholic society that fought its own battle on the basis of the revenge of the cradle, having large Catholic families, the Quiet Revolution, and within the lifetime of Jean Chrétien, the whole thing was reversed. Quebec went into a negative fertility rate, right? So that has a profound consequence in terms of society, in terms of cultural mores, and so on. That's what's happening in the United States. The feminist movement that came forward, we changed, in the nature of the workforce change, the nature of man-woman relationship change in that sense, the empowerment of women and the consequences of that in terms of family, where the women goes out to work and the family dwindles to a nuclear family, which in effect over time comes to mean that the family is simply the biological parents and a designer child, one or two. What say the Chrétien's family or say the Kennedy family, look at how large Kennedy's family was. That is Joe Kennedy and the brothers and sisters of John Kennedy. A family meant uncles, aunts, grandparents, children, and a whole connection of people. So within a generation, family has changed into a nuclear family. And the children of this nuclear family that grows up in a wholly different situation, which has a different psychological impact individually, and then sociologically, socially, that has another profound impact. And what is happening, let me throw it out right now. In this period, we see the seeds of what later on people will call the culture of narcissism. That is, ultimately, the connections are broken and an individual becomes simply self-interested in himself, herself. Now I don't know what pronoun to use, so say individuals in the plural sense, in themselves, and that has a critical social impact. A liberal society, a liberal democratic society that came into being, the industrial age that came about at the latter part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, again in Europe and North America, heartland of the United States, which developed the modern age, came about. The one of the key aspects in terms of ideas and intellectual discourse was a sense of history, study of history, understanding history, of where we have come from, what are the changes that have taken place, where we are going, and so on. History has diminished. The study of history has completely diminished because in a society with a people that are only interested in themselves and their desires to be fulfilled, their needs to be fulfilled, their individual concerns, the sense of history is lost because there's no interest in the past nor any interest in the future. It becomes a very sterile relationship, and that's where we have arrived at. A culture of narcissism ends up in a culture of wokeism where we are.
It's not just
what is wokeism? You have talked about that. I have talked about that in the past. It is a culture of death.
it's not just narcissism, Salim, which is, as you say, a philosophy of self-love.
Yes.
You see the image of Narcissus looking in the pool, staring at the image of himself, enamored by it.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a culture of hedonism, pleasure for pleasure's sake at the expense of all else. That's with the free love generation, the drug use, the psychedelic generation. And then what we have today is an offshoot of that, perhaps part of that, which is the philosophy of nihilism. There are no values. There is no objective universe. There is no objective laws. There can be no right, no wrong, no good, no bad.
It's all subjective. Yeah.
It's subjective. It's like whatever. And this is part of the narcissism, part of our culture and the culture of the Beatnik generation was that whatever I want goes. If I want to be a woman, I can be a woman, regardless of objective reality.
Right.
Right. That's the pinnacle of the nihilistic, narcissistic philosophy we're seeing today in the transgenderism. I don't think it can get any more bizarre than that. And if you look at the art of that time, it was encapsulated in paintings like a Jackson Pollock, splashes of paint on an acrylic canvas, versus a Michelangelo or any of the classics. And today, what do we have? The art is no better. The music is hardly better. You look at Lady Gaga's latest presentation, where she's out there playing the piano. And by the way, she's an excellent pianist and a fantastic performer. However, what is she doing? She's out there doing her thing, and her entourage are vomiting on her as she's playing the piano. That's the level of culture today we see from the nihilists who have no values, the narcissists who are in love with themselves to the detriment of friends and family and society. And so in that respect, Salim, I would suggest that the anti-war protesters of that time in the 60s share the same sort of philosophy as the pro-war people today. Again, if you're going to be supporting Ukraine over Russia, you don't know the story. You don't know the history. You're anti-intellectual, you're anti-history. It's a culture of ignorance, I think, in both respects, back from the 60s till today.
Well, I mean, exactly. I mean, you're laying down all those variables which has brought this situation where the opening question, where have all the flowers gone, is answered. That the culture has changed. I mean, as we are speaking, I read the news that in Netherlands, the Miss Universe is a man who considers himself a woman, and will represent Netherlands in the final round of the Miss Universe contest. So a man could very well be the Miss Universe for the world. I mean, that would be the ultimate or maybe there's more ultimates to come. I mean, the very word ultimate has lost its meaning, that will show up as Miss Universe or whatever it is, that will be up for prize. The word bizarre has completely lost its meaning. But going back to 1960, which is where we begin with this question, in the post-war, post-1945 period, it is in the 1945 war and the horrors of that 1945 war, which is captured by so many different pictures or icons and images, the pictures of the death camps of Europe being liberated, with the Allied soldiers going in, and the pictures that we have seen or are available, when that people saw and are available, can go back and look at it, horrific pictures, of what man can do to others, the mass killings that took place, the fire bombings of places like Dresden, or the Blitz that occurred over Britain, and so on, and the final picture of the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the mushroom cloud, and what it meant, and it was all there. And the generation that we're talking about, who comes of age during the Vietnam War, have those pictures. They've gone to school, and then going into school, within a matter of 1945, the war ends, and the Cuban Missile Crisis is in 1962. That is 17 years, if my maths is correct. No, not even 17. Yeah, 17 years. The children are being taught in the school, that this is what you have to do when the alarm goes up. So the impact of that in the minds of the children who will come of age and come of age, and who then become part of this anti-war movement that begins as the Vietnam War proceeds from 64, 65 onwards, and becomes uglier and uglier. So those are real and very disturbing, and people recoil from it. But on the cultural side, and therefore on the political side, as I've already said, this is the most affluent society, and the children of the most affluent society that is coming of age, and what they're also being told, and what they're also learning, iconic movies that we can now look back upon. It could be taken as a spoof, or it could be taken as a propaganda. I'm thinking about movies like Dr. Strangelove. You'll stop fearing the bomb and begin to love it, right? Well, we've begun to love it. We don't take care about it anymore. The children who became the vanguard of the peace movement, in that sense, culturally, politically, and in their activism, their children and grandchildren have come to love the bomb, that they don't care about it anymore. You see?
There's even, Salim, believe it or not, there are even today people out there who do not think the atom bomb or the nuclear bomb exists. They suggest that perhaps that it was a chemical fire in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah.
That this is a hoax.
Yeah.
I've seen comments on Reddit to that effect. And so again, it is the destruction of knowledge and the ignorance out there that is going to be our downfall.
Yeah, I mean, it is basically like, hey, Bob, don't bother me with your explanations. I want to go and take my, next shot of whatever it is, opioid, cannabis. I mean, when cocaine a bag of cocaine is found outside of the national security room in the White House, and the rest of the country couldn't care less, shrug the shoulder. That this current president and all the disclosure about his corruption and his sellout and his son, and there he is, with a straight face representing America to the world, and nobody cares. So what is going to be the caring of the possible that as we approach, as we incrementally, here's the president who's sending cluster bomb to Ukraine, and Bob Dylan was singing about how many, cannonballs must be fired before it is all brought to an end, before it is banned, and people were rallying around it. So again, the juxtaposition of these images and these facts tells how far degraded or derailed what was once the beacon of freedom, freedom not as licentiousness, freedom not as irresponsibility, freedom the way John F. Kennedy explained it, that we hold your values, communism, as repugnant, freedom as free thinking, respect of the individual, respect of the...
I think didn't he put it in our last video? We talked about this, freedom for rational people in a rational world or something.
That's right, exactly. To where we have come, which is the collective sense of the degradation of all that I was not born in America. I was not born in the West. But India would not be what India is today as an Indian-born person in terms of modernity without the waves of enlightenment that emanated from the West, washed into India, whether, with of course, the English in the first instance, but other Europeans, other parts of India had other Europeans, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and so on and so forth. And right across what is today the global South. And when the global South looks at now the West, the collective West, what does it see? It is the abandonment of moral and religious value. It's a hole at the center of the West, this whole wokeist agenda that the West wants to export and impose is being collectively rejected by the global South, and a huge chasm is opening up as a result of this war. But this war, I would go further to say, is symptomatic of the degraded West. This war should never have happened. If there's unnecessary war, people have talked about the unnecessary war and written about it, the Second World War, or even the First World War. In fact, the phrase, the unnecessary war, was first used by Winston Churchill to refer to World War I, in which he participated as a member of the cabinet, war cabinet. But there it was. And so the generation that is the left, and I use that, again, the idea of left in this discussion, not as communist or as socialist or as Marxist, left in the classic sense of people-oriented. After all, the Whigs were the left in British politics. It was about freedom. It was about market. It was about the people. And the Tories were about the landed class, the upper class, the privileged class, the protection of their values, and so on and so forth. Edmund Burke, who is celebrated as the conservative in North America, or particularly United States, Burkean ideas, Burkean politics, Burkean philosophy. Burke was a Whig. He was a classical Whig. That's about freedom. And so war was the antithesis, the complete opposite of freedom, because war is about control. War is about imposition of everything that chokes freedom, right? It is conquest. It is imposition. The victor in a war is going to impose their values upon the vanquished. So the left, in that sense, was the anti-war movement. And by the way, the Whig Party, the great Whig Party, in that classic sense, that defense, going back to Adam Smith and all the way down, which is what you and I, again, in the political philosophy term, share in common. You born in Newfoundland and I born in India, in Bengal, separated by 12,000 miles. But what is the idea that brings us together? The idea of freedom based upon individual right and everything surrounding it, right? So this great Whig Party becomes a war party during World War I, and then it is destroyed. The Whig Party has never, that is the Liberal Party of England, has never elected a prime minister after Lloyd George, who was the war prime minister.
I occasionally come across a young man, and I say to him, "You remember the war?" He has but the faintest memory of it. It is therefore vital that this generation should know what war means.
The Liberals were replaced by the Labour Party, and Liberal have become the third or the fourth party in England, whereas it had dominated the 19th century and going back to the 18th century, it was the party in that sense of the values on the which, we talk about enlightenment that blossom. So left and right, in that sense, the left was the anti-war party. And I would say what has happened is left has betrayed all its values. There is no left party, but there was a left party. And that left party was, at least nominally, not in substance, I would distinguish, nominally presented itself as a caring party of the less privileged, the underclass, the new immigrants. I'm talking about, again, American politics, and a working class party, whereas the Republican Party was the party of the WASP ruling class, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's why immigrants came and they joined the Democratic Party, or they were recruited into Democratic Party. The Republican Party was the party of the old, landed interests and so on and so forth, but also in that sense became the party that represented the oligarchs, the financial interests, the banking interests, the industrial interests, the question of freedom, America as the land of freedom, the beacon of freedom, was a constitutional principle. And as a constitutional principle, there is, in that sense, no left-right division in America. It is a defense of the Constitution, the first 10 amendments and so on and so forth. But those started changing with the rise of the progressive movement, which was on the left. But on the question of war and peace, it was the left. So in the 1960s, there was that left position in American policy. But there's another fascinating element, Robert, that comes into play. This most affluent generation goes to war. That means in America at that time and time preceding the 60s was that every male was conscripted or drafted. You have to report to your draft body. You turn 18, you're registered, and you will be called up when needed. There's no exception. Was reading recently President Franklin Roosevelt's son's book as he saw it. He's talking about his father, Elliot Roosevelt. And it's fascinating. In 1939, Elliot is in his late 20s. He's starting a business. He's going to Texas and starting a business. And then the war comes. And he comes to Washington. And he's talking with his father about his business and what he's going to do and so on and so forth. What will be America's position? America's at that time neutral. This is 1939, 1940. And his father tells him that America has to be prepared and ready. And that's what his government is going to do. But he doesn't tell him, according to his son, doesn't tell him what he should do, Elliot should do. Elliot has to make his own decision. Elliot goes back to Texas and he registers with his draft body. And he joins the United States Army Air Force, he registers there. He comes back to Washington and he tells his father. And father begins to, tears swells up in his eyes and cry. He doesn't say anything. And Elliot says that his father became so proud of him that he had gone and registered. He was not taking an exemption because his father was the president. And in 1940, his father would be running for the third term. He joins. He serves in the United States Army Air Force, as does his younger brother. I think his name was Franklin, also Franklin Jr. He joined the US Navy, and so on and so forth. Everybody joined. Everybody was concerned. That's John F. Kennedy, his brother, Joe Kennedy, et cetera, et cetera. So now you are in the 1960s, the new generation, the kids born in the 1940s, now they're faced with this war, and draft is taking place, and they have to join up, or they look at the deferment. Who are we talking about? We are talking about the generation that produced the Clintons, the Bushes, that is Bush 43, Donald Trump, Al Gore. Obama is, of course, 10 years younger. The Vietnam War is over. Doesn't come in. But that generation, the generation born during or end of World War II, all of them without exception took deferment, whatever the reason it was. You see, who went to war? The middle class and the lower middle class kids went to war. They couldn't get the deferment. Or the blacks in number. Remember the famous case of Muhammad Ali, or at that time, Cassius Clay, world heavyweight boxing champion. He was called up. He said, I will not go. What do I have against the Vietnamese? They haven't shot at me. They haven't done anything to me, And he stripped of his thing and sent to prison, right? So what I'm driving at is this generation's raising the campaign of peace movement has also got another element attached to it. That is, they have to go to war. They don't want to go to war. As many as can are either going to seek deferment or going to run away. So many of them came to America, to Canada, to escape from the draft. That is what led to the peace movement, the campaign, the violence on university and college campuses that ended up in the tragedy in Kent State University in Ohio, with the National Guards coming in and a shootout that took place, and a number of students died. This was the inflamed position. The assassinations and the murders and the cities burning, the convergence that took place with this civil rights movement and the anti-war movement coming together. And again, the numbers of blacks who were being drafted and sent to Vietnam, people who then subsequently rose in the rank, who did stay, others, who became the collateral damages and casualties of the war. But people like Colin Powell, who later on becomes four-star general and so on and so forth, came out of Vietnam, or the current Secretary of Defense, also a four-star, Lloyd Austin, came out of Vietnam, and so on. So the blacks or the minority population in much heavier number were involved in the Vietnam War as conscript, as a draft army, conscript army, citizen army, however one wants to define it in America. And then that enraging conflict in the political arena led to President Nixon's massive victory in 1968, when Johnson basically said that he's not going to seek second term. He knew that, the war had destroyed his career, there would be no possibility. Robert was running also for the nomination and so on and so forth. The Democratic Party ended in a massive, disorder. The Chicago conference I'm talking about, where there was confrontation between students and the people who came to the convention, the Democratic convention. Nixon wins the 68 election massively. He talks about the silent majority and so on and so forth. But on the political level, what does he do? He ends the draft. And with the ending of the draft, the plug is pulled. The peace movement fades away.
This is interesting, Salim, that if you go back to that age, the protests really began with the involvement of the United States, primarily in around 1965 is when a lot of the troops started to go over to Vietnam. And so this was during the time of a Democratic administration under Johnson. Mm-hmm. And the protests continued under Nixon, a Republican administration. So it did not necessarily follow along party lines. They were demonstrating against the United States being in the war, regardless of who the president was.
Right.
Bring it into today, and what do we have? We have in power, in Canada at least, the shining example of our broken culture, Justin Trudeau, and in the United States, the usurper Biden, who is a shining example of the destruction of that society as well, and the corruption of that society. So I don't think that the supporters of these people make it seemly to go out and protest what Justin Trudeau is going to say. I mean, these are the followers of Justin Trudeau. These are the followers of Biden and the Democrat Party and the Nancy Pelosi's and that kind of ilk. So if they were to go out and protest the Ukraine war, they'd be protesting their icons. Perhaps there's an element of that in there.
Or rather paradoxically, not their icons, because they have no icons anymore.
That's right. They're nihilists. They have no values.
So, because that's the narcissist culture. They have no value, except the value is themselves. Freedom means for them licentiousness, what they can do. It is not freedom in the construct of what it was the Enlightenment value. The freedom to think, the freedom to speak, the freedom to dare, freedom to question. All of those are now being suffocated. If you question wokeism, then you are a bigot, you're a racist, right? So what has happened is the inversion of a free society in that classic sense of Whiggism, which is where you and I associate with our support and defense of freedom. That goes back to Adam Smith, that goes back to Voltaire, that goes back to the idea that a free society is a society that respects an individual, because it is the individual rights that makes meaningful what a free society is. It is not, as Martin Luther King put it, it is not the color of the skin, it is the conduct of the character of the individual that matters. So in that sense, consistent with our philosophical position, I would say you and I, and I don't think I would be putting words in your mouth, that you and I both would say, it's none of our business, as what Pierre Elliott Trudeau said, what happens in the bedroom of the nation. I'm not interested in, what sort of orifice you are trying to penetrate or experiment with, So coming back to the peace movement, what happened was not only in the case of Vietnam, and you're right, the war went on into the Republican time. The war started under a Democratic president, Lyndon B. Johnson, and it ended under a Republican president, but it continued before it ended. That was Nixon, Ford. But the critical thing that took away the passion of the peace movement at that point in time was the ending of the draft. People were burning their draft cards. Remember, that was the symbolic burning that was taking place.
Quite rightly, I would say. Conscription is slavery.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that ended. However, the generation still had, I believe, a leadership that went back to not, they were the generation of World War II. They were not born after World War II. There was a leadership, and that leadership, intellectual leaders, cultural leaders, religious leaders, they were there, and they were genuinely committed to the fears and concern of a nuclear war. So that's what I'm referring to, the father of the current prime minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He did not go to Europe to fight in the Second World War. And now, in retrospect, again, history is contested. History is paradoxical. In retrospect, one can say that the anti-conscription movement in Canada was ironically a peace movement, both in 1914-18 war. It was led by the people in Quebec, and then again in 1939-1945, the conscription, to which our prime minister at that time famously replied, conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription, to diffuse the crisis. And the French Canadian, in large part, did not participate in that war, despite the fact that France had fallen, which is their connection to Europe, had fallen, but they did not. So now, in retrospect, 80 years and counting, we're coming close to 80 years, or over 80 years now. 1939, the war began, and the anti-conscription movement, that the people engaged in anti-conscription were against the war. And that man who was against the war as a young man in his 20s, now as a prime minister in the 80s, in his last official capacity as the leader of a country, dedicates himself to go out, whether it is virtue signaling, whether there is substance to it, whether there is, was there any effect in really tangible sense on the Americans, that was the Reagan administration, or on the Europeans with Maggie Thatcher and others in Europe. Irrespective of that, or regardless of that, the fact of the matter is Prime Minister Trudeau launched a peace campaign. And there was resonance to that peace campaign, or he converged with that movement that was already at play in Europe against nuclear rearmament, campaign to end nuclear armament that was in Europe in the early 80s, led by, once again, by the left. And the largest component of the left in Europe, ironically, or historically, because of European politics, in France, the largest party on the left was the Communist Party. In Italy, the largest party on the left was again the Communist Party. And in Germany, the largest party on the left was the Socialist Party. And you have in the 1980s, President in France, a socialist and communist alliance, Francois Mitterrand. You have in Germany, the socialist SPD Chancellor, Willy Brandt. You have Euro-communist leaders in Italy, in Spain, and then you have the left Labour Party leaders in Britain. They're all coming together in this campaign in early 90s as NATO, America, led by America, then, now, was committing itself to position intermediate nuclear forces armed with nuclear warheads in Europe. And a campaign was begun. So what I'm leading up to is that in the affluent West, relatively speaking, but America is the most affluent society in all of the world at that time, there was concern about nuclear war. It was real, at least in the minds of a very substantive number of people among the citizens and among the leaders who were on the left. You know, there was a real concern about the war. Soviet Union was there. You know, if there's a miscalculation, or if there is, an escalation in the dispute, it can rise up to a nuclear level. And then what happens? 1989, Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall comes down, and by 1991, Soviet Union is gone. And so that real fear of a conflict that can escalate to a nuclear war with a generation who are still in power, because all of them, Pierre Trudeau, Mitterrand, all of them without exception, Chancellor Brandt, Helmut Schmidt, and others, Maggie Thatcher, they all were young or had participated in, had been drafted in the Second World War. They'd seen the devastation. They'd experienced it. They knew the dangers. And so they rallied, they spoke about it, and the church leaders spoke about it. And now you think about it, 1989 is over 40 years ago, or coming to 40 years. So the current group of leaders, Rishi Sunak in England, Macron in France, our Justin over here, they were not around. They have no memory of 89. They have no memory of anything before 89. So the whole generation that has grown up within that larger context of a culture of narcissism.
It's a circular thing, isn't it? Sometimes history. And I just watched, just before we sat down to have this conversation, I watched a video by Glenn Beck where he gave a little story of where he was hosting a woman who had just escaped communist China recently. And it was at Christmas time, and she was putting up the lights, and she broke into tears, saying that when I was in prison in communist China, I was making these lights. And she was put into prison for being a Christian. And then she said that, I wish that America would fall. And he said, why? And he says, because only then will you realize what you've lost, to paraphrase her. Mm. And there's the circle. It's almost as if we need some catastrophe to understand exactly what we are lost. And on that theme of circular history, the lyrics of that song, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, are circular as well. Seeger wrote the first three stanzas, and then Hickerson wrote the last two to bring it circular, because the first three say, where are all the flowers gone? Young girls have picked them every one. Where have all the young girls gone? Gone for husbands, every one. Where have all the husbands gone? Gone for soldiers, every one. And then Hickerson added, where are all the soldiers gone? Gone to graveyards, every one. finishing up with where have all the graveyards gone? Gone to flowers, everyone. So Celine, to answer the question that we first started with, where have all the flowers gone? Well, they're on the graveyards and they're forgotten. So hopefully the girls will pick them up again and remember. And before we start the cycle all over again, I hope it doesn't come to war. But it's been a fascinating conversation, this delving into history and the nature of our culture and politics. And I thank you very much for your insight once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.